President Donald Trump wrapped up his attendance at the G7 yesterday, sharing news of a 14-point agreement with Iran that will formally be signed in Switzerland today. The memo of understanding has been hailed by world leaders as a major step toward peace in the Middle East, but questions as to how the deal handles Iran's nuclear ambitions remain.
Mr. President, you've been saying all week that this deal permanently prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but the drafts of the deal that have been floating around barely mention Iran's nuclear program. So can you explain how exactly the deal achieves that goal?
So when I say permanently, it should be permanently. But if it's not permanently, we will bomb them. They will be bombed, just like I bombed them on Wednesday night and Tuesday night, and was going to bomb them on Thursday night at a level that was 3 times greater, and they knew that.
Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor, here to break down the latest following the G7 summit and talk about the future of NATO is USA Today White House correspondent Francesca Chambers. It's good to have you here, Francesca.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with developments regarding the U.S. and Israel-led war in Iran. What did the president share about the possibility that an end to this war is in sight? And will Iran agree to not pursue a nuclear weapon?
So this made for a pretty wild end to the G7 summit as a leaked copy of the draft language of the Memorandum of Understanding began to circulate around the G7. A couple of news outlets got their hands on it. Then the White House started to dispute in the president parts of that. And so by the time we got to the president's final news conference, we had a sense of what was in this memorandum of understanding, including the fact that the United States, along with its Arab allies, would put together this $300 billion fund for Iran's rehabilitation. Now, this has immediately become a sticking point, Dana, because the president said repeatedly during the G7 summit that the United States was not going to contribute any money to this fund. But the way that it's worded in this framework agreement suggested that the United States would be investing in the fund. The president said, no, that's not the case. If Gulf nations want to do that, they can do that, but that's not something that the United States will be doing. So that was number one. As far as the nuclear part and enriched uranium and retrieving that enriched uranium that is currently in Iran, this agreement only deals with it insofar as it commits the United States and Iran to continuing to have those talks over the next 60 days. But it doesn't outright prohibit Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, obtaining one, purchasing one, or otherwise giving the United States the enriched uranium. A lot of these things are kicked down the road into this final negotiation that hasn't yet taken place. It's really important to stress that this agreement, this preliminary agreement, really just deals with ending the war against Iran, as well as reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and then everything else in it, whether it pertains to sanctions relief, or this investment fund, or nuclear, or the enriched uranium. These are all things that the United States and Iran are committing to discussing as part of that final negotiation.
I need to ask a question that many Americans may be asking themselves in this moment. If, as you said, we don't get the nuclear agreement that was given as the premise for this war to begin with, what did the U.S. gain by spending hundreds of billions of dollars along with the sacrifice of American lives?
That's absolutely in dispute right now. The president and the White House say that what they did was they knocked out Iran's army as well as its navy. They really weakened Iran militarily. If you recall, U.S. officials said from the very beginning that the concern was that Iran was getting so strong militarily that if it wanted to, it would be able to produce a nuclear weapon eventually, and then the United States wouldn't be able to counter militarily. Now, whether this agreement ends up being better than the JCPOA, which was the Obama-era agreement, that's something that's still up for debate. And you've seen even allies of President Donald Trump, lawmakers on Capitol Hill, say that they can't yet defend the agreement that Trump has put forward because they don't know what's in it. Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, who's retiring, saying on Capitol Hill that I can't defend what's in a secret agreement. And so now, as we've started to see these details come out about what is in this memorandum of understanding, again, that's not the final agreement itself. So there's still a lot to be negotiated yet.
Francesca, most of the G7 attendees belong to NATO, and the U.S. war in Iran has exposed some divisions within the alliance. The friction here isn't about sharing the burden of funding NATO. This is a strategic disagreement. Tell me about those disagreements and whether the G7 was able to come to any resolution here.
You're right that it's most of the NATO allies that were there at the G7 summit. Now, this is important because it was a first test for these countries and President Donald Trump ever since he started threatening to withdraw from NATO. And the NATO summit is on its way. It will be in a few weeks. And so it was the first opportunity for President Trump to get in front of these leaders since he began criticizing them for not doing enough, in his view, to support the United States in its war against Iran. He was very frustrated with these countries for not allowing the US to use its military bases, some of which the US operates jointly with those countries on their soil, to have its attacks on Iran. So this led to renewed frustration with the president about the NATO alliance. It was also a really critical time because France and the United Kingdom are leading this coalition that is volunteered to come in and help clear the Strait of Hormuz, either through demining efforts or to help escort ships through the Strait of the Hormuz once it fully reopens. We've seen the president go back and forth between whether he wants allies' help or he doesn't want allies' help at this point, but certainly his frustrations haven't went away, even though you saw allies such as France and its president Emmanuel Macron really try, to charm the president and charm their way out of his frustrations with them.
Russia is still at war with Ukraine at this moment, and there are worries within the alliance about how NATO might respond should Russia continue to stress test NATO's boundaries. Did you get the sense that these NATO members who were at the G7 are on the same page with regard to countering any Russian advances on the rest of Europe?
Yeah, this has been a critical sticking point between the United States and other members of the NATO alliance, including those that were at the Group of Seven. You heard Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, saying, that he had a difficult meeting with President Trump, partially because of this issue over Ukraine. Notably, President Trump didn't meet one-on-one with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky while he was at the G7 summit. There was a working group that the United States participated in that Zelensky was also a part of. But it wasn't, as it has been sometimes in the past, when the president met one-on-one with Zelensky. And so while the US continues to support Ukraine in its war against Russia, it is notable that this didn't happen because this comes at the same time as you've seen the United States, since President Trump returned to office, not give Ukraine any more funding. The United States supplies weapons to Ukraine, but they're paid for by the NATO alliance. We've also seen that President Zelensky has asked the United States for interceptors, and the United States has not provided more. Zelensky also asked for the United States to just allow Ukraine to partner with other countries to produce these Patriot missile interceptors. But the United States hasn't done that either, with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying recently that it's something that the United States is open to considering, which is production of these Patriot missile interceptors with other countries, but it is not something that so far he's greenlit. And so there continue to be a number of these issues that I think you'll see play out in more detail at the NATO summit.
The Trump administration has recently announced scaling back its commitments to NATO. Where and how significant are those cuts, Francesca?
The key thing here is that the United States said that it was going to end a rotation of troops that was supposed to go from Germany to Poland. Well, that caused a firestorm among NATO members. And so then the United States said, okay, never mind. We're going to send those troops to Poland. We're going to continue on with that. But it has NATO members, especially those in Eastern Europe that are close to Russia or share a border with Russia, very concerned that the United States is not going to fulfill its troop commitments moving forward, and that this could be something that encourages Russia to take its war outside of Ukraine and to continue to test NATO's boundaries. Now, again, the United States did end up sending those troops to Poland, but what if next time it doesn't, is essentially what the allies are asking. And I wrote recently about how this was one of the ways that the US could pull back from its commitments to the NATO alliance. The U.S. doesn't necessarily have to withdraw from the NATO alliance in order for the United States to be able to pull back on its commitments. In fact, it'd be quite difficult for the United States to pull out of the NATO alliance because Congress has made it so that Trump can't do so unilaterally. It has to pass with the support of the United States Senate, and it would need a 2/3 majority to do that. Well, that's difficult considering how many lawmakers continue to support Ukraine as well as the NATO alliance at this point. And so the United States has found other ways to scale back its commitments to NATO, these troops being one of them potentially. But there are other things that the United States can do too. I mean, if you look at just President Trump and whether or not he's even going to the NATO conferences, he's went every single time to these summits during his first term. But he last time showed up later. The conference was only lasting a day because at that point, they didn't expect that President Trump would even stay for a full 2-day summit at that point. And there were questions leading into this one about whether President Trump would attend either. Now, so far, he's kept to the Article 5 commitment that an attack on one is an attack on all. But there are still questions about whether or not, if that actually happened, the United States would be there for NATO.
The annual defense policy bill has lawmakers reasserting at least some control over European troop deployments with provisions that would prevent the president from using Pentagon monies to reduce their numbers below 67,000 without ample justifications. Does this signify the commitment of at least some Republicans to NATO support, even if the president is not on board?
We've seen Democrats and Republicans unite together to really try to keep the United States commitments to its NATO allies, but its European allies. It's one of what you could call the few bipartisan issues left in Washington, which is this military support for U.S. allies, as we've heard President Trump continue to threaten the NATO alliance. I mean, he has said that NATO wasn't there for the United States, referring back to the Iran war and the perceived lack of support. And so he said that the U.S. might not be there for NATO in the future.
How have other NATO countries responded? Have they in any meaningful way started to prepare for a future where the U.S. is no longer a key ally?
We've seen over the past years that Europe has, one time or another thought about creating some sort of an EU military. The EU already cooperates when it comes to currency and when it comes to other issues. They all share a border. You can move freely throughout the EU. So there have certainly been conversations about these things, Dana, taking place for a number of years. But the NATO alliance is still, as even the US has said, the longest and strongest military alliance in the history of the modern world.
As you said, the NATO summit is approaching. Turkey will host that in Ankara July 7th and 8th. As we head into that summit, what are the biggest unanswered questions?
Well, President Trump didn't unload on NATO allies while he was at the G7. I mean, he looked unhappy when he was meeting with Emmanuel Macron right after he landed on the ground, right? But, he didn't really lay into NATO allies. And so that's something I'll be looking for heading into this NATO summit. Does he come out swinging against them? Does he make more threats to leave the NATO alliance? Does he get upset about their defense spending again after they agreed last year to spend more than the 2% GDP? In fact, they agreed to spend 5% GDP. Some of that's infrastructure and other things, but they did agree to get up to 5% roughly GDP on defense spending. Does he make new demands of the NATO alliance? Those are key questions heading into this summit that we'll just have to wait and see what happens, Dana.
And then finally, there's still a lot of uncertainty here. If the alliance continues to fracture, what might NATO look like a few years from now?
One key question is whether Ukraine will ever be allowed in the NATO alliance. That's something that's being debated as part of a potential deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine wants to be in the NATO alliance. In order to have future protection, Russia has said that's a red line for them. So that's constantly been on hold. Is that something that is part of a final deal? It's completely zeroed out. A couple years ago during the Biden administration, the NATO alliance was saying that wasn't even up for debate, that Ukraine's future in NATO was secure. I mean, these are all key questions that during the Trump administration have come back up again. So there's quite a bit for the NATO alliance to discuss as it looks toward the future.
Francesca Chambers is a White House correspondent for USA Today. Thank you so much, Francesca.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.